All right, I think we're online. Hopefully, we're online. If you want to check, that'd be great. If you're online, you're able to hear us. It's a good thing. We're going to be in Revelation chapter 2 tonight, and we're waiting just a minute. They're checking to see if we're live streaming since we're a one man show tonight. Everybody on. It probably does say 6:20. I didn't change the date on it. Well, let's see. It says it's streaming. I think we are. I think we're all right. Yeah. If I get rid of some of this, I could find out. There we are. Yeah, it's on. Yeah, sometimes it takes a few minutes to start the upload to the different sites. But all right. Well, we're going to be in Revelation chapter 2 tonight, and we were in there last Wednesday night, actually, last couple Wednesday nights and a Sunday school. And we talked about the church at Ephesus last week. And I was just telling everybody I was gonna skim through the churches and get right into Revelation chapter 4. But there's a lot of good stuff in Revelation chapter 2 and 3 that I think we just need to hit on. And now some of this is prophetical, some of it is commentary from other people, and I'm just going to present some of it is just these are some different ways to look at some passages, not so much that this is what it means, because there's a lot of people that believe different things, and I'm not at the point where I'd say, well, this guy's definitely wrong, this guy's definitely right, because both sides very well could be right. They're just looking at it a different direction. So let's start back where we give a little bit of history. So Revelation, we remember, was written around 95 to 96 AD when John was on the isle. And he's going to dictate 7 letters to 7 churches. They were actual physical churches, but these 7 letters to the 7 churches also can apply. We look at it 3 different ways. So you have the 7 physical churches. We have what you can call the 7 types of churches that we would apply to today, the different types of churches. And then we also look at each church represented a church age in history. Some people hold to that, some people don't. You can line it up with different periods of time, and you can line up some of what they talk about in those periods of time. So I would say you'd be safe if you believe that. If you didn't, that's fine. You don't have to. The thing is, what we can take out of this are the warnings that God gives these 7 churches. Some things that we should watch out for in our churches today, even if you don't worry about church ages and all that stuff, they're still good because it gives us things to watch out for. Now, tonight we're talking about the church in Smyrna. And this is one of 2 churches that God has nothing negative to say about. And you'll see why once we get into it. And I went ahead and I got AI to draw me up a nice map. And we'll look at that in just a second. So historically, or actually, let's look at the geography of it here. We talked about it a couple of weeks ago of why this area of the country is always so fought over and so divisive, why everybody wants it. There's never been peace in this area. And if you look at I have 2 different maps. So one, let's see, the top one, this one, that's kind of an expanded view. So you got Western Europe over here. There's France and Spain, Africa, North Africa. And then over here, you have the Asian countries on the right side. So, but look at all this stuff in between. If you can own this little area right here where all these 7 churches are, you control the trade from one side of that map to the other. Because if you don't go through there, then you're going to have to go all the way down around the bottom of Africa and all the way back up the other side if you go by sea. Now, if you go by land, you can get there right through here. You can come right through here, either cross the sea there, or come across through, this is modern day Turkey, up into here, up into, there's Greece, there's Italy. So you see how important that region is. That's why there's always been fighting there. Every empire that was any kind of a great empire, they always fought for control of this area, the Middle East. Why? Because if you control that, you can control the world's economy. It's a very important piece of land. And it's interesting that all 7 of the churches that we're going to talk about are right here in this place that's so important. What better way to reach the entire world with the gospel than to plant churches where the entire world passes through? Uh, I was up at Shenandoah Sunday night and I got to hear Pastor preach, and he was talking about the 4th of July thing coming up on Friday night. We could go out, and he made this comment. He said we could go out and knock on 200 or 300 doors, and maybe a couple will show up for church, or they can hold a 4th of July thing like they're going to do this Friday, and they'll have 300 or 400 people come to them. So which one's better? Well, obviously you can reach more people if they come to you. Same thing we do here on the mountain. It's better if we can have a big event or go to a fall festival or a trunk or treat where we have a bunch of people come to us instead of us trying to find them. We can reach them. We can give them the gospel, even if it's on a piece of paper. So that's why this area is so important. And the best place for these 7 churches is right here. This is one of the reasons why why John was trying to write to these churches, because even John knew how important this was. Because a lot of the trade, overland trade, this was the shortest route between East and West. Now, we're not thinking about North and South America. Those weren't really part of the picture. But this part of the world was. And now let's talk. We see the 7 literal churches up there, but let's go through them real quick. So you got Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So you got 7 distinct churches, and if you look at them, it's kind of neat how they're laid out. They're kind of laid out in a U shape. See Ephesus right here. We talked about that one, and that's way down here by the sea. Then you got Smyrna, another coastal town, which is very important. And then Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. They're in a nice little U shape. So if you think about it, if there was like Paul, or if there was another missionary that wanted to visit the churches, they could do it all in one pass, either forwards or backwards, and you could get all of them and all the places in between. Because we're going to see each one of these were major hubs of activity, or they had something in that city. Maybe it was a natural resource or something important that brought a lot of people to those areas or through those areas. And I didn't go over it last time, but the church at Ephesus, this was kind of the beginning of the church age. They count that period to around 30 AD to around 100 AD if we're going with church ages. And this is more of the apostolic church, where we still had the apostles that planted many of the churches. In fact, most likely Paul was the one that planted the church at Ephesus. And then the next one we have is here, Smyrna. This is the persecuted church. And if going by church ages, around 100 AD to around 300 or so AD, 310, 320, somewhere in that area. And we'll look at the other ones as we go through. But you can look back in history and see the different time periods, especially this time period, because Smyrna's going to talk about a lot of persecution. And there was a lot of persecution that went on during this time. Now, Ephesus was a good church. Remember, we talked about that last week. That was a great church, but they had a problem, and that their heart wasn't in it anymore. They lost the love, the zeal that they had at the beginning when they started, and they allowed things to they compromised things and allowed things to slip in. And God had some things to say to them. Now, Smyrna, we're going to look at something else. Ephesus was a wealthy church. They were a wealthy society, a big society. But Smyrna is going to be the opposite. While the city was popular and it was fruitful and it was rich and wealthy, the Christians were not. So let's look at our text in Revelation 2, and verse number 8. And it says, "Unto the angel of the church of Smyrna these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive." And again, we're reminded the center of the book of Revelation is about Jesus. Verse number 9, "I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have a tribulation 10 days. But be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Now, one thing we're going to have to remember, because some of these verses can be taken out of context. Well, we'll get to it. I don't want to get too far ahead because it won't make sense yet. So, what was so important about Smyrna? It was a very wealthy city right on the Aegean Sea, about 35 miles north of Ephesus, so not too terribly far. You could probably walk there at a good day, maybe two, or longer if you were slower, but possible you could get there in a day if you had to. Now remember, the Romans had built a system of roads, so it made it a lot easier to get around to these churches. This was probably one of the most beautiful cities in Asia Minor, because it, again, right there on the Aegean Sea is a beautiful place. The coastal areas there, even today, are very beautiful. There's a lot of tourism in that area. This was at the time known as the Crown of Asia because of its beauty. But here's one thing that was very important about Smyrna. It was extremely loyal to the Roman Empire. I mean, we talked about Ephesus last week. Yes, they were submissive to the Roman Empire, and a lot of Roman officials moved to Ephesus but the reason they moved to Ephesus is because the Roman emperor, didn't have his thumb pressed as hard on Ephesus as he did some of the other places. So they had a little more freedom in Ephesus to kind of set themselves up, many kingdoms and things like that. But now in Smyrna, they were over the top for Rome. They were very zealous towards the empire and towards the emperor. Politically, this was one of the very first cities that actually built a temple, not to a god, but to Rome itself. Almost, it's an odd thing to think about. And in Smyrna, emperor worship was not optional. You did it. You had to do it. It was required. It became expected. Citizens of Smyrna were required to acknowledge Caesar as a god or as Lord. Well, can you see the problem the Christians would have with that? They can't abide by that because to them and to us, Jesus is Lord. And because of that, it made them enemies of Rome. And I'll tell you this, it still goes on today. There's places in our world today, you cannot have a church. You cannot preach the gospel. If you do, you'll be put to death. You'll be tortured. You'll be persecuted, whatever the case. Religiously, it contained many pagan temples. They did have emperor worship. So they worshiped the emperor of Rome, and there were several that we're going to talk about. But they also had a very large Jewish population. You say, well, what does that have to do with anything? The Jews were also opposed to a lot of Christianity. And even still today, the Jews are opposed to the message of the gospel. And so there were a lot of Jews. And so not only were the Roman citizens against the Christians, but now you have a large group of Jews that are against the Christians as well. So the believers that were in Smyrna were constantly under pressure. It started out not too bad, but as Christianity grew and churches grew, they get word from the church at Ephesus how well it went and how good it's doing. And now we have another church pop up and they think, well, we're going to have to take care of this. We're going to have to deal with it. But the believers often suffered, and they suffered in many different ways in Smyrna. If you did not abide by their policies, most of them would lose their occupation. They'd lose property. They would take property from them. I was just listening to a story this morning about the Smoky Mountain National Park. And I was listening to the story of the last resident of the park. And he died in the mid 1900s. He was born in the 1800s in a little cabin. And they said it was so far out away from civilization, he actually had to go towards town to hunt because even game wasn't that far out. And he lived there, and he was one of the few people, also there's some people in Cades Cove, but he was one of the few people that the government tried to come in and do eminent domain and take their land to give it over to a national forest or national park. The reason they did that's because lumber companies came in and stripped everything, and they owned a lot of the land. So when the government offered them money for land that was useless to them, yeah, they took it. And but there was one old man, and he was born and raised in that cabin, and then ended up dying in that cabin. They even had an audio recording. Somebody interviewed him, and the things that he did. He lived up into his 90s, and no medical care. In fact, one time when he was a few years before his death, they said he took a fall, and they did have to take him to a hospital, and he was there for 10 days. And he kept getting sick from drinking the water at the hospital. They had to go back, send somebody back to his cabin to fetch water out of his spring and bring it to him so they could keep him hydrated. That's how reclusive this guy was. But the government came in, they started buying everybody out, and a lot of people would not sell. And so they made him a deal. Now, he had no use for the government. It's like those old Appalachian people. Government people are not welcome on their land. And he was a holdout, one of the holdouts. And so the government said, all right, here's what we'll do. We will let you stay and keep your land until you die. Once you die, you have to sell us your land, but you're only going to get half the value, which the government's probably thinking, well, they're dead. They don't need it anyway. Well, this guy was so mad, and he even shot at some politicians that tried to come talk to him and this and that. But long story short, the government ended up getting he was the last one to leave the park. I think there might have been a few people down in Cades Cove, but as far as the mountains, he was the last one. And but this is what would have happened in Rome. If you were a Christian, the Roman Empire, the government could come in and take your land, take where you live. They could ridicule you. You were put in prison. This is the time where martyrdom would have begun. Do you know the name Polycarp? One of the very first martyrs. He was, history records that most likely he lived here in Smyrna, and some historical records say that there was a good chance he pastored this church in Smyrna for a while and was then later executed as one of the first known martyrs. But Jesus doesn't criticize Smyrna at all. He only encourages them because they're going through a lot. So let's look at what they got. Verse 9, we read that just a minute ago. Verse 8, God's again introducing himself. He's the first and the last. But then he says, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty. And here's what we're going to talk about. This first thing, their affliction. We're going to talk about how you persevere through trials. It's comforting to say the first words out of his mouth after he introduces himself. He says, I know what you're going through. I know your works, the things that you're trying to do. And I know about your tribulation. I know about your poverty. He said, I know all this. And so how does this apply to us? Because God knows us too. He knows our pain. He knows our burden, our persecution. He knows our discouragement when we're just having a day that we're down in the dumps. God knows. If you like to write in your Bible and you want to highlight those words or underline those words, I know. Because God knows what we're going through. God knew what the church at Smyrna was going through. Nothing escapes God's eyes, his attention. If you want some verses to back that up, we won't read them tonight, but in Hebrews and Psalms and Matthew, all three of those passages are great. Hebrews 4, Psalm 56, and Matthew 10 all talk about how God cares even when we think he's not there. So then there was another issue, though. He knows our suffering, but then in this verse, we've got to talk about it. We're going to get a little bit out of order, but he talks about the blasphemy in verse number 9. Did you see that? He said, I know thy works, tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which said they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Now, there's a lot in that verse to unpack. In fact, I even used a little bit of AI and said, give me some facts about this verse or pull up some commentaries. The thing went on forever. There's a lot of different people that have a lot of interpretations about what this verse means. So I'm going to give you kind of a buffet, if you will, and you can take what you want out of it. So the blasphemy, we've got to explain a little bit. Jesus, and some people will take this as a segregation type thing. They say they're Jews, but they're not, and so being a different race is a blasphemous thing, and that verse has been used for that method. But it's not what he's talking about. He's referring to those that really claimed to represent God, but actively and openly were denying that Christ, the Messiah, actually existed, and they were the ones that persecuted. So they were, remember, a Jewish nation, and the disciples, the apostles, they were all Jews. Now, Paul was also a Roman citizen. So we have a Jewish religion that's coming out of Jerusalem, spreading into the entire world. And Paul even wrote to the Jews first, and then later also to the Greeks. So this was a gospel meant for everybody, but the Jews were trying to reach as many Jews as possible. So when he says the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, he's not saying, just because someone's Jewish doesn't mean they're instantly of the of the synagogue of Satan. Of course, they knew what synagogues were, and that's what he was comparing them to. Paul wrote something about this in Romans chapter 2. He said, "For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart and the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God." Now, keeping that in context with the rest of Scripture, there's a lot we could pull out. We realize that God or the church is not God's new chosen people. And he says, even there, it's not about the circumcision that they do on that. That's just not what makes a Jew a Jew. It's about the heart. And when something changes on the heart, it doesn't matter what race you are, what religion you are at that point. If there's something that God does in you, then that converts you into one of his children. And he's trying to get the point. A true Jew is one inwardly. And he's not saying that the church is now the Jews, because a lot of times they'll use this verse and say the church is now the Jews, but that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, if you believe the gospel message, just like the Jewish people have, you're kind of ushered into the same group. Peter had to deal with some of this about churches preaching about circumcision, and you had to be circumcised to be saved, and that just wasn't true. And so Paul was making a note of it. But the issue was not the ethnicity. The issue was about their faith. Were they putting their faith and trust in Jesus Christ? And what you had a bunch of people that claimed to be Jewish, because those were the main ones receiving the gospel at this point, at the beginning. So they were claiming this Jewish ethnicity, but then outwardly they were going about trying to destroy the church or sneak in and get information to try to get people thrown in prison. And today we can compare that to what's going on today. Today in our society, we have people that claim to be Christians, and they say all the right things, they do all the right things, they wear the right clothes, but inwardly they are as lost can be. And the same thing was going on here. You have people in churches that are lost, that are not saved. And usually, I don't want to say usually, but I would say a lot of the time when we hear about church splits and people getting mad and stuff, I think there's a lot of people involved in those things that are not truly Christians. Now, if our church split tonight, we'd have one church with one member there and one over here. But you get what I'm saying. And I know churches go through trials and they go through hard times. And sometimes it is the right thing to do, to leave. It's not good to get everybody in an uproar and fighting and fussing with each other. That's not scriptural. You do it the right way. And then if the pastor is doing something wrong, or if there is something going on in the church that's not being addressed, there is a right way. And the Bible outlines that, how to deal with it. And if the pastor or the deacon or a church member does not abide by what the Bible says, the Bible is pretty clear on what you can do as far as breaking fellowship and not allowing, because God's trying to protect his church, just like a shepherd protects his flock. God's trying to do the same thing. He doesn't want anybody sneaking in, trying to cause division and divisiveness. And the worst thing is, in Baptist circles today, there's so much division. I keep telling my wife, I was like, I'm about ashamed to have Baptists on our board, because you hear all these other Baptist churches, they got this going on and that going on. And it seems like every single scandal is about a Baptist church. So was it just Baptists that have scandals? No, but those are the ones that seem to fight each other the most. I better stop with that. We'll keep going. But they wear it, but they don't live it. And the warning is this, and this is a good little phrase. I read this is not mine. I read this somewhere else. Profession without possession is dangerous. Profession of faith without possessing Jesus Christ is wrong. It's dangerous. Our walk must match our words. So next one, they were poor, but they were rich. They had little, but yet Jesus called them really rich. Because their wealth was not measured the same way Rome measured wealth. Well, Rome measured wealth by how much land you have, how much money you have, how many things do you have. But Jesus said it's not about the things. It's about something totally different. And he's going to explain why in a minute. They were rich in faith and character and holiness, endurance, all these things they had. But everybody else looked at them and said, oh, those poor Christians, look how bad they have it. Let's keep moving on, but let's look at their abundance. Number 2, they were rich in faith in verse number 9, but thou art rich. It's almost like when John's writing this, God stopped John and interrupted him mid-verse. If you look at it as a whole, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty. And then if you have a Bible like mine, it's got parentheses around the next statement, but thou art rich. And then he goes on to talk about the blasphemy and all this other stuff that's going on. It's almost like God said, John, wait a minute. I know these things, but be sure to tell them they might have all these afflictions. They might be poor. They might be persecuted, but they're still rich. We'll say, how can you be poor and rich at the same time? Well, they may be poor in earthly possessions, but in heaven, they're earning heavenly rewards that will last in eternity. Well, how are they earning those? They were telling others about Jesus. They weren't falling by the wayside when things got tough. They weren't losing faith when their faith was tested. They kept on trusting and they kept on believing. They had character, they had holiness, they had endurance. And one thing that they were going to receive, we'll see it in the last verse, is an eternal reward. But let's keep going. Their abundance, they're rich in faith. It says, but thou art rich. And God said, let me just tell them. So, earthly poverty does not equal spiritual poverty. The world measures success by what you have, how much money you have, how much influence you have. God measures it in faithfulness and holiness and obedience. Those are the things that God looks at. You think God knows how much money is in our bank account? We don't impress him with our money. We don't impress him. If I brought a tank up here, I wouldn't impress God. We don't impress them with things of this world. Lord, look what I've got. In fact, I hate to say it, but a lot of people get mad, but a church building does not impress the Lord. There's people that spend millions and millions and millions on making a beautiful building and a beautiful facade. And I'm not saying we shouldn't make things look nice for the glory of God, but God's not impressed with our building. In fact, if God was to walk by 10 churches and 9 of them were the 9 most wealthy churches in the world, he'd probably walk into the 10th one and give that one highest priority, because it's not about the building. God doesn't measure the success of a church by how it looks on the outside. I told you I stuck on these Appalachian podcasts. Some of these communities, they only had church every few months. When the preacher would come into town, they'd meet up at somebody's barn. They'd meet up at somebody's shack on the edge of town, or they'd just gather around in the town square. They say, well, that's not church. They can't call that church. Yeah, they can. That's what church is. It's a group of believers coming together to learn, to worship, to fellowship, to praise. That's what the church is. It's not about how big of a building or how many people you can seat or who comes and preaches at your conference, or if you get invited to go preach. God's not impressed with any of that. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of that either, but he's not impressed. Think of that widow that gave the 2 mites. God said he favored her over the ones that gave out of abundance because she gave everything she had. So their earthly poverty does not equal spiritual poverty. Trials often produce richer faith. Easy lives rarely produce mature Christians. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago about, when things are tough, when, rent comes due and bills got to be paid, I seem to pray a little bit harder, a little bit more, a little bit longer. But when things are going easy, I tend not to pray as much because I think, well, I've got this covered. I don't need God to help me out now. Easy lives don't always produce a richer faith. I wish I was at the point where I could have more money and have faith and prayer all at the same time. But I think that's a thing you have to grow into. There's some people that have tons of money, but you wouldn't know it seeing them sitting in church. They're there, they serve the Lord. They give, but nobody sees what they give. They're not doing it for the reward. We've had people give gifts to this church, not for recognition, but because they wanted to do it for the Lord. And you say, well, they did it out of abundance. They have so much money. No, I don't believe that's the case at all. Some people do have a lot of money, but they come in and they maybe give. We had it happen here last year. Someone came in and gave a large chunk of money to the church. Why? We still don't know why. The sermon wasn't that great that day, I didn't think. But, because I think a lot of people realize, well, God's not impressed with my bank account, but if I can be a blessing to a church or to a ministry, then I'm going to do as the Spirit leads and directs and guides. That's what he's impressed with. And God can entrust money to people that use it that way, that use it to further the glory of God and the kingdom of God. I guess he doesn't trust me with that much money. Maybe one day. I think about myself. I don't trust myself to have all kinds of money. If I had more money than I knew what to do with, I'd blow it on stuff I don't need. Everybody always says, oh, if I win $1 million in the lottery, I'm going to give half to the church. Don't lie. You're not going to give half of it to the church. First time you drive by the car lot and see that big brand new truck sitting there and fishing boat next door and all this other stuff, you're not giving half of that to the church, and God knows that, and we know that in our heart of hearts. We just say that out loud to make us think we're spiritual, we're somebody. And I know good and well, if I won the lottery, I probably would not give half of it to the church. There'd be too many toys I'd want to buy. But again, this is where God was talking about. They're poor, but they're rich. So what makes somebody truly rich? Think about this, and I read this as well somewhere else. If everything material that you owned disappeared tomorrow, when you got up tomorrow morning, you had nothing, would you still be rich? That's a good measure of your faith and how close your relationship is with God. Think about, that's a hard thing to think about. I'm thinking about all the stuff. If I woke up and my guns were gone, or if Russ's fishing rods were gone, it might be a little sad. And then that's a test of faith right there to see, are we still trusting God? Because now we've lost everything that we were depending on. We've lost it all. All we have left is Christ. You can lose everything, though, but still possess everything at the same time. Well, let's move on. The last part, their admonition. So he talks to him. Now he's going to give him an admonition in verse 10. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. And I want to try to wrap this up quickly, but we're going to talk about a couple different things. First off, he says, fear none of those things. What things? The things he was just talking about. The persecution, the poverty, the tribulation, all those things. Fear none of those things. And fear none of the things that you're going to suffer. He's not just saying what you have suffered. You're going to suffer more. And it says, behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried. And ye shall have tribulation 10 days, be thou faithful unto death. So there's a couple phrases in here. I want to pull these apart real quick and maybe make them make a little sense. So he said, fear none of these things. even if Satan comes in and persecutes, even to the point of death, we don't have to fear it, because who has conquered death? Death has no power anymore. You say, well, but so-and-so, they just passed away. But who holds the keys for life and death? Jesus Christ has the keys to death. You die only on his terms. You are born on his terms. God gives life and God takes life. You say, well, what if somebody go out and shoot somebody and they die? You didn't, well, from our standards, yes, you did kill them. But in God's eyes, he's the giver and taker of life. You see these guys come back from war. They've been hit with an IED or a shot or a grenade, whatever the case may be. No possible way did anybody think they would survive long enough even to get from the helicopter back to the hospital. They thought they'd die on the battlefield, and yet they're still alive today. Now, they've suffered, but it wasn't their time. I just hope I'm not on the airplane when it's the pilot's time to go. That would be bad. But you see what I'm saying? Man may try to take life, but God's the giver and the taker. So don't fear death, because they were going to face some death. And it says the devil shall cast some into prison. He identifies a real enemy, not just a figure of, there's going to be a movement against you. He say, no, Satan himself is going to attack. He's going to have a spiritual warfare with you. And because of this, Rome then became the instrument that Satan used to persecute the Christians. But ultimately, Satan was behind it. It wasn't Rome that was behind it. It was a satanic, a demonic influence behind it that was causing Rome and all those people around to persecute the Christians. Christ tells them right here, don't worry about it. Don't fear it. Just persevere a little bit longer. You say, why? Because he says 10 days. Now, there's a bunch of different interpretations of these 10 days. And I know, Miss Shan, I think you asked me a couple weeks ago, why does God not just tell us exactly amounts of time? Why do we have to figure it out and this or that? Some of it I don't think John even fully understood. So the 10 days, there's too many different interpretations of this for me to do all, but I'll give you a couple. One, and this is probably a good interpretation. First, I thought 10 days, okay, there must have been like a standard in Smyrna where if you broke a law, you went to prison for 10 days. I had a prison sentence. If you did something else, you got to. But historically, there's not really any kind of record of that. Now, it very well could be that maybe if you were found to be a Christian, you were put in prison and you suffered for 10 days and then you were let go. Very possible, but there's not much to back that up. But it is definitely a possibility, and I wouldn't rule that out just because there's no record of. Again, a lot of historical records, especially when they're written by like the Roman Empire, they're not going to put things in there that they don't want people to know about later on down the road. They're going to write history in the best light possible. So very well, that 10 days could have been a literal 10 days where they were cast into prison. And during that time, some of them could have died, maybe because of torture or beating or anything, malnutrition, whatever. Good interpretation. There's another one that says the 10 days is just a finite time that we can use that as a symbolic thing of the tribulation you're enduring is not going to be indefinite. It's only going to be for a short time. And that's probably where I would say I would lean a little bit more towards is this fact of it, because Scripture does back that up. Christ said, you will suffer persecution for a season. There's other places in Scripture where he talks about suffering as Christians and being persecuted, and it's just for a short time. He always uses something to make you know it's not going to be eternal. It's not going to be forever. It's just going to be for a little while. We were talking about the dentist this morning, and y'all were trying to convince me it's not that bad. It is that bad. But even when I was at the dentist this last week, I hated every second of it. I was sick for 3 days before because I knew I was coming. I didn't want to go. But once I got there, I had to think, okay, it's not going to last forever. I'm only going to have to be here for a little bit. And sometimes that's the only way you're going to get through. Sometimes you just got to say, you know what? I'm going through a valley. I'm going through a hard time. But realize it's not going to last forever. Just yesterday, some friends of mine or people I knew in Florida, uh, a great couple. They're part of a church in Okeechobee, and the man's wife passed away yesterday. She had a battle with cancer, and things progressed very quickly, and she passed away yesterday. Well, they tried everything they could. They didn't catch it early. They caught it late. It was very late, almost untreatable. They said she did the chemo and everything she could think of, and they tried to fight it. But ultimately, the prayers, I mean, there were people praying all over the country that God would just touch and heal. And on this earth, he did not. But yesterday afternoon, he did heal her completely by separating her from this earthly body and took her to heaven. Say, well, I don't like that. That's what we prayed for. We prayed that God would heal, and he did. He got rid of the old cancer-ridden flesh, and he healed her. Said, you don't need that old broken down body anymore. And one of these days, Barb, you're not going to have to worry about the aches and pains. God's going to say, you can leave that body behind. You don't need that anymore. We don't have to fear that day. Now, I'm not looking to go this afternoon, but we don't have to fear that day. As Christians, we know that day's coming. It could be tonight. It could be tomorrow. It could be 20 years from now, 40 years from now, 50. I don't want to live that long. But we don't know when it's going to happen. But we don't have to fear it. And so even in trials, even if, and he talked about, even if death was the ultimate price they would have to pay for their faith, they don't have to fear it, because your persecution, it's going to last a short time. Even if you die, it's still only lasting a short time. And then you don't have to worry about it anymore. Your suffering has limits. And think about this. God is still in control. Remember, God is the giver and taker of life. There were probably too many to count. I don't know if a historian could ever give us a number of how many Christians were put to death or how many Jews were put to death in the Holocaust. You know, we say 5, 6 million, whatever. There's probably way more than we know about. But again, what got some of these people through those times? What got the early church? How did they get through that persecution? They realized it was only going to be for a short time. If I can just endure one more day, God's going to be faithful. Now, I want to talk about these 10 days one other way. And some, because I even went online and I was like, tell me some of the far-flung ideas about these 10 days. You can get down a rabbit hole really quick. There's some crazy ones out there. We'll leave the crazy ones off the list. But there was one that kind of piqued my interest and it made sense. And I thought this would be a good one to share. The 10 days. Because remember, we're talking about the church ages, different periods of time. In Smyrna, they say, okay, these 10 days would cover about the same amount of time that they attribute to the church age of Smyrna, for about a little less than 300 years. Over that time period, there were 10 Roman emperors, and all 10 of them persecuted Christians all through this time period that they say this was this church age. You had Nero. Some of these I may massacre. You had Nero, Domitian, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, Septimius Severus, Maximinus Thrax. I'm going to name my next kid that. You had Decius, Valerian, Aurelian, Diocletian, and that's the last one, Diocletian. All of these started around 64 AD, somewhere in the mid-60s AD. Let's go with that. We've heard Nero. We've heard the stories about Nero. That all started in the early church and the Roman Empire in the mid-60s AD. So by the time we're getting to John's writing in the 90 AD, the church had been persecuted now for about 30 years. Nero was merciless, but it didn't stop. Now they had a slight break from AD 68 to AD 95 between those two emperors. there was a slight break, but even though the emperor wasn't persecuting, they were still being persecuted at a local level. And it goes all the way up to Diocletian, which he stopped being emperor in AD 300, or 313 rather. So we see that time span correlates pretty close to where the church age of Smyrna is. So a lot of people equate, okay, that 10 days. So we can look at it three ways. It was a literal 3 day or literal 10 days in jail, or it was a figurative, just it's going to be a short amount of time, or it's another more literal translation of prophecy, because of this time it was around 90 AD. So they're saying, okay, up to the year 313. So there's different views on those 10 days. Which one do you believe, or which one? It doesn't matter. I think the one we can take away from, though, it's only going to be a short time. It's not going to last forever. Now, during those persecutions, some of them were born and died under the same emperor. They never saw life outside of persecution. You say, well, how is that still a short time? Because our time on earth compared to our time in heaven, even if we're born and die in persecution, still, you say, well, that's a whole life. That's not a short time compared to eternity. It's just a blink of an eye. It is a short time. So what happens after this? This says they get the crown of life. It says, let's see where we're at. Verse 10, right? Fear none of those things. The devil shall cast some of you in prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful even unto death, even if they take your life. Be faithful. And if you are, I will give thee a crown of life. And I want to this is what I wanted to hit tonight, and make sure we get clear on this, because this is going to come up again in the book of Revelations, that will receive a crown of life. Does that mean that everyone who was ever martyred went to heaven? Not necessarily. Martyrdom, and see, I know the Catholic Church teaches this. Martyrdom automatically gains you entrance into heaven. Islam teaches if you go blow yourself up, that's a ticket to heaven. That's not what gets you to have this crown of life he's talking about. It is not salvation. It's not you went through troubles, just come, you get to skip the line. You get to go to the front of the line to get into heaven. And a lot of people will say that you just have to do enough good works. You have to stay faithful to God. And if you can do that, then you'll get this crown of life. You'll go to heaven. That's not the crown of life we're talking about. Well, so how do you know? Well, let's look at the next verse. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of what? The second death. But in the previous verse, it talked about those who endure even unto death will receive a crown of life. But that crown of life, that's not what gets them into heaven. That's a reward for remaining faithful to God, but it's not what gets you into heaven, because their faithfulness and our faithfulness will not save us. We can be in church every single Sunday. We could never miss a service our entire lives and still die and go to hell. Why? Because we never let it go from here to here. If it's not here and it's just here, we're just playing church. We're just playing dress up. So this crown of life, what is this crown of life? It says the crown of life, and then in the next verse, he that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Not the first. What's the first death? When we die, this body dies. It breaks down and it's done. And it's put in the ground. But in Revelation 20, it clears it up. And we'll hit it a couple times as we're going through. Revelation 20 and verse 14, it says, and death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So they're going to be saved from the second death. What's that mean? Well, their faith and trust in Jesus Christ guarantees them a home in heaven. Not the crown of life is a reward that only certain people are going to get. The crown of life is going to be reserved for those who died in the faith, or died for their faith, or were persecuted for their faith. And then everybody who believes gets the reward of not suffering the second death. The second death, the first one is separation of body and soul. The second one is separation of the soul from God for eternity. That's the second death. So what do we see through all of this stuff? They teach us faithfulness is more valuable than comfort. Spiritual riches outweigh earthly riches. Opposition does not mean abandonment. God knows what we're enduring. Our suffering is temporary, but our reward is eternal. So let's think about this as we go the rest of our week. Are we rich where it matters? That's a tough one because everybody's got to look at that for themselves. I can't look at you and say, oh, you're physically wealthy, you're spiritually wealthy. I can't judge that. That's something between you and God. Is our profession matched by our practice? In other words, we profess to be a Christian. Does our practice display that? Would our faith survive if it cost us everything? And for the people at Smyrna, it did. It cost them everything to become a believer. And you got to think about this. And I know there's other religions, they have suicide bombers and all this stuff. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty, you can really tell if somebody's life is on the line. That's when you can tell, are they going to say, no, I'm really not a Christian? Or am I truly a Christian? Would our faith survive, even if it cost everything? Now, if somebody put a gun to my head and said, are you a Christian? If you confess Christ, I'm going to kill you. Or if you deny Christ, I'll let you live. I'd like to say yes. I'd say you go right ahead. You're not going to hurt me at all. Death is just a release from this earthly world. But did that cost me everything? What if somebody pulled my kids out in front of me and put a gun to their heads and said, deny Christ or I'm going to start murdering your children in front of you? Or I'm going to torture your wife in front of you unless you deny Christ. And that's what many of these persecutions, and if you've ever read about them, many times they would do this, especially mothers and children. They would torture the children to get the mothers to denounce Christ. That is forsaking everything for the cause of Christ. There's story after story of mothers hanging on to their children as they're ripped away from them and fed to the lions, or beaten, or tortured in 1,000 different ways. What would our faith be like if we were to lose everything? That's a tough one. Because I can say all day, oh, my faith's strong enough. If somebody wanted to put me to death for my faith, no problem. But now you're starting to get to things that are important to me. Now you can take away my guns, you can take away my house, my truck, my tank, if I ever get one. You take all that away, and you know what? I'd say, okay, God, you're still good. But when you get to the stuff that I really love, like my family, I'd have to think about that. I've never had that happen, and I hope it never does. And I hope it never happens to anybody in this room or online that we're talking to. But that's what Christ was saying. Don't fear death. Remember the things that we hold on. I mean, who gave me my children? That God gave them to me. I just get to raise them and put up with them for a few years. But those are God's children. He gave them to me. And if he chose to take them away, that's his right. And there's a lot of children that do pass away. And many times that'll destroy families because they'll get angry at God. They'll get bitter. And that's just human nature. But where would our faith be? If everything, I'm not talking about just money or your life. I'm talking about if everything was stripped away from you, where would your faith be? And I think Smyrna was commended for that because they persevered. They were faithful, even in the face of losing everything, realizing that the suffering, it won't last, but our reward in eternity will last forever. So they may have looked poor, but they were rich. If persecution came to America tomorrow, like it did back in Rome, would we still show up here Sunday morning, knowing that if we showed up here on church on Sunday morning, they were going to haul us off to jail. They were going to, put us in handcuffs or take us to the electric chair. Would we still show up on Sunday? I have a feeling a lot of churches across our country, there would be a lot of people not show up. And that shows you who's faithful and who's not. who shows up when things get hard. So here's our prayer. We need to be the kind of Christian who remains faithful, not just when it's easy, but especially if it starts to cost us something. That's when we need to stay faithful. That's what God through John was trying to tell the church of Smyrna. Stay faithful, even if it's hard. Because he says, I know what you're going through. I'm not blind to it. We were talking about this with Moses on Sunday. God was not blind to the plight of Egypt or the Israelites in Egypt. He saw, he heard, he listened, he knew their situation. And he remained faithful and he kept his word, and he'll do the same for us. Let's be faithful. And it's easy to say, but you walk into work tomorrow morning and it'll be the hardest thing you've ever done to try to stay faithful in the face of adversity. And let's just pray that God will help us to remain steadfast. Let's pray, then we'll be done. Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for all you've done for us, Lord. And I pray you just help us this week, Lord, to think about these things that we've talked about tonight, about being faithful, even in the face of losing everything that we hold dear, knowing that there's a reason for it. And Lord, help us to trust you. And I pray you'll be with us this week, be with those that couldn't be here tonight. Watch over us, God. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Let me see.